Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, we'll be previewing this fall's recall elections and taking a look at recent recall trends to see what we might be able to expect in November. Joining me now is staff writer Doug Kreneisel.
Hello, Victoria.
And joining us for the first time is staff writer Abby Smith. Welcome to the show, Abby.
Hi, Victoria. Thanks for having me.
Of course. We have been asking our staff writers that join us on the podcast to kind of give their Ballotpedia origin story. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about yourself and what you do here on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. So I started out on the research team, which kind of got absorbed by other teams, ended up on school boards for a while, and now I'm on the elections team. So right now my day-to-day kind of is focused really on November 8th. We're getting up all of our candidate lists. State and federal lists are pretty much finalized. We've got a few write-in filing deadlines we're working on, but specifically local candidate lists are we're all plugging away trying to get all those done before November 8th. And then I also cover school board recalls. So I'm really excited to join the show and talk about that.
Yeah, this is an exciting topic that has been for the last couple of years. Since Doug has been on the show a few times, I'm not going to have him give his backstory. Everyone knows he loves South Dakota and Weird Al. So we'll just move on to the topic at hand, recalls. But before we jump into the trends and what we're going to watch in November, I thought it might be important to actually define what a recall is and how they work and why did they happen in the first place.
Those are some great questions. So a political recall is a process that allows citizens to remove elected officials from their positions before the terms are completed. So the general process involves circulation of petitions by recall organizers. Then there's an evaluation process that election officials look at those signatures, verify that, the person signing is the person who they are, they live in the right district, that kind of thing. And then there's usually a public vote after that if there's enough signatures that have been verified. Virginia is the exception to that public vote. In Virginia, recalls are sent through the court system once enough valid signatures are found. And then other states that use the recall process, they all have a public vote. So kind of digging into the details of how the recall process works, that varies a lot from state to state. Some states have signature requirements that are a specific percentage of votes cast in the last election for that office or a percentage of the registered voters in that jurisdiction. In general, though, there's a certain number of signatures that a recall organizer has to get, and they have to go and collect those signatures, physical pen to paper signatures, and then they submit them in a certain deadline. Those deadlines can be as short as, 30 days in some states. In my own state of Wisconsin, you have 60 days to get all those signatures. Other states don't have any kind of timeline at all. Overall, 40 states allow the recall of certain local officials, and then 19 of those 40 states also allow recalls for certain state officials.
And what happens once it finally gets on the ballot?
Yeah, so the election method also varies by state. There's kind of three different types. So the first is a basic yes-no question. Enough signatures have been verified. It's going for a recall, and what a voter sees on the ballot is, should we recall this official, yes or no? If that goes with a yes majority, that person is removed from office. And then it can be like an appointment process to replace them, or a special election will be called later. But for that specific type, it's just a yes, no. Another type is, it's really just a special election. My own state of Wisconsin uses that. So if there's enough signatures, it gets to the ballot, that official will basically just have to run again for an election. There'll be an incumbent on that ballot, and then they'll run against candidates who filed to run against them. And then the third option is kind of a blend between the two. It's a two-part question. So that first question is a yes, no. And then the second question is a list of replacement candidates. In that case, if a yes is a majority, whoever gets the most votes in that replacement candidate list would then replace the official who was recalled.
So to sum it up, the states handle them differently. Recalls can happen for all kinds of political reasons, right? And they can happen in both state and local government.
Yes. Yeah. There is no process for federal recalls at this point.
So since 2012, we have published 2 recall reports a year here at Ballotpedia, one at the end of the year and one in June. Doug, I'm wondering if you could share some of the highlights from this year's mid-year recall report. what were some of the biggest recalls we covered?
Yeah, definitely. There were a ton of recalls we covered the first half of this year that were really interesting, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to run through a few of them. So cut me off if I go too deep into the weeds. I'm going to start off first with Colorado's Governor Jared Polis. He's a Democrat. He faced a recall effort early this year that ultimately did not qualify for the ballot after organizers did not submit the number of signatures they needed by the deadline. Supporters of the recall criticized Polis's handling of the coronavirus pandemic and made some allegations regarding his federal income tax. This was actually the third recall attempt against Polis since he was elected in 2018. And not really sure why. It's pretty easy to start a recall petition in Colorado. You kind of just need to file a form saying, I would like to do this now. But then it's kind of hard to get over the line because you need signatures equal to 25% of the ballots cast for that office. So in this case, for governor, and you have to do that within 60 days, which is a lot of signatures in not a lot of time. But as far as recalls that made it to the ballot, listeners of the show probably remember or are familiar with what was going on in San Francisco this year. And San Francisco had a crazy history. I don't know if I have the exact fact off the top of my head, but the last time that a local official in San Francisco there was a recall against a local official was when Dianne Feinstein was mayor of San Francisco. And there have been no recalls. And then this year, there were two really big ones that actually ultimately resulted in removing candidates from office. So the first was with their school board election. That actually got started last year, but then the election was held this year. 3 members of the board were removed from office in February. Organizers of that recall said that the board members spent too much time renaming schools and not enough attention to reopening schools. So another kind of coronavirus-related recall effort here. And then the second big one in San Francisco was their district attorney, Chesa Boudin's recall in early June. That one, again, Boudin was removed from office. Organizers said that his policies had contributed to an increase in crime rates. There was a group called San Franciscans for Public Safety that was led by 2 Democrats that initiated that recall effort in 2021 after a previous effort led by Republican mayoral candidate Richie Greenberg was unsuccessful. But this one ultimately was successful on the part of the recall organizers. And then finally, kind of getting away from the limelight, one that really stuck out to me was a recall in Leelanau County, Michigan. In this race, voters recalled County Commissioner William Bunick, Republican, and elected Lois Ball, a Democrat, as his replacement in an election on May 3rd. What's interesting about this is that this election actually switched the governing majority of that board from Republican to Democratic. And organizers of this recall effort initiated the campaign after Bunick, along with 3 other board members, recommended zeroing out the county's early childhood services millage that was passed by voters in 2019.
Yeah, those are all really interesting races. I have a quick general question. Do most recall campaigns have paid signature gatherers, or is it a volunteer effort most of the time? Do you guys know that?
It's usually volunteer.
Okay.
Definitely depends on the state, if they allow that or paid ones or not. But most of them are local. Most of them are unpaid volunteers.
Good to know. Returning back to our mid-year report, we had tracked 152 recall efforts against 240 officials, which sounds like a lot, but it actually represented a small decline from that point last year when we had tallied 165 recall efforts against 263 officials. By the end of 2021, there were 545 officials targeted for recall, which is the most of any year since we began tracking recalls. This is way more than we saw in recent memory. For instance, in 2020, we saw 301, and in 2019, we saw 233. So, Abby, will this year continue to have the high level of recalls we saw last year, or are we looking at more of a return to business as usual?
It's looking like we're returning to business as usual. The surge we saw from pandemic-related recalls appears to be ending. So far this year, we've tracked recalls against 349 officials. So that's much closer to our running average between 2012 to 2020. The average was 315 officials a year. So close to that, a little bit higher, but more in the norm. But another interesting tidbit from this year is that it looks like city councilors are once again going to be the officials with the most recalls against them this year. City council members drew the most recall petitions from 2016 to 2020, but school board members took their place in 2021 and in the first half of 2022.
Can you unpack that for us a little bit? Why was there a surge of school board member recalls last year, and why do city officials typically boast the highest number of recalls? Not sure that's something you actually want to brag about, but you get what I mean.
Yeah, so the coronavirus is the simple answer about the increase of school board recalls. So I'm going to paint you a bit of a picture here to kind of explain that. Recalls were down in the first half of 2020. Unsurprising, if you put yourself back into March of 2020, things shut down. It's hard to go out and get, physical pen to paper signatures when, businesses are closed and you have to socially distance. So we saw, definitely a downturn. It started ticking up again, though, at the end of 2020, as, we got used to the new normal and, the decisions that our officials, city officials, school board officials, and county officials were making were really physically, affecting what we could do. Did we have to wear a mask? Could we send our kids to school, or were they at home with us? Things like that. All these decisions were really affecting people in their homes. So if they didn't agree with those decisions, one recourse was to start recall petitions. And so we started to see those kind of start to climb again. And that resulted in 2021. It just really continued through that. And that's when we saw that really high number for that whole year. So 2020 ended up with 301 officials, like you said earlier. That's close, but below the average. So a bit lower than what the average we usually see. So of those in 2020, 30% of those recalls were COVID related in some way. So if you take away those 30%, you can see how much lower that number would have been. So again, 2021, our highest year for recalls, 535 officials. 40% of those were COVID related. So with that picture in mind, I will tell you 40% COVID related recalls 2021. That equates to 214 officials. Of those 214, 156 of them were school board members. So that's 73% of COVID related recalls were school board related. And that's why school board recalls took off and took over from city council members. As to why city officials typically have the highest number, that's really just a numbers thing. There are far more cities, towns, and villages when you group them together than there are school districts, counties, or state legislators.
That makes sense to me. Believe it or not, guys, we are almost a month away from November 8th. Before I let you both go, I'm wondering if we can highlight some of the recalls we're watching on Election Day this year. I understand there are a few states with multiple different recalls, but let's start with those states that only have one, Missouri and Colorado.
Yeah, definitely. In St. Louis, Missouri, all 3 members of the Robertson Fire Protection District are facing a recall election. Citizens to Save Hazelwood and Fire Services is the name of the group that submitted the required 2,300 signatures to the St. Louis County Board of Elections, and voters will now decide the final outcome. And I will say, one of the things I really love about our recall coverage at Ballotpedia is the work that Abby and others do at explaining why these, what's the impetus, what's the reason that people are saying for these recalls? Because, you get down to things like fire protection districts, but we get a pretty decent picture of what's going on in these really kind of hyper local elections. It's a lot of fun. So listeners out there, go check out our recall coverage if this is not enticing enough.
And what about Colorado, Abby?
Sure. So Colorado, this is one that I'm covering. It's recall against Sonia Hutchinson, and she's a member of the Buffalo School District RE4 Board of Directors. So this recall began in July, and supporters expressed frustration with Hutchinson's actions during the board's search for a new superintendent. They said she, as they described, went rogue during the interview process, which resulted in one candidate withdrawing from the list of applicants. Hutchinson did not comment on the recall effort, and this recall is the type with both a yes and no question and a replacement question. So there is one candidate who filed in that replacement race, and his name is Mike Kirschbaum.
There are also some noteworthy November 8th recall elections in Texas and California. Let's start with my home state of Texas. Can you tell me about recalls happening here, Doug?
In Denton, Texas, the election to recall City Council member Allison McGuire was initiated by former City Council member Don Duff and several of his colleagues. That petition said that the primary ground for the recall was a meme using a scene from the Eric Andre show that McGuire had posted on Facebook in January 2022. See what I mean? It's the best local coverage that you can get. This meme criticized former Denton County Transportation Authority member Chris Watts. McGuire later removed the meme from the post, but we'll have to wait and see if it ends up costing her that seat or not. And in Lamarck, Texas, the town's mayor, Keith Bell, will face a recall. Bell was elected mayor in May of 2021, and then this effort to recall him started in July of 2022.
How about over in California? I understand there's a recall happening on the 8th, but also in a few weeks on October 19th.
Yeah, so I'll start with the one on the 8th. That's a recall election for District 1 City Councilman Alan Lee, and that's in Big Bear Lake, California. Organizers alleged that Lee had violated campaign spending and public records laws and had created a hostile work environment for the city manager. Lee did not file any kind of formal response in response to that recall. And then the one on October 19th is in Redondo Beach, and that is against District 4 City Councilman Zaino Baji Jr. That one is happening on October 19th because of the timing of the recall. California requires recall elections to be scheduled between 88 and 125 days after the election office announces that enough signatures were verified to put a recall on the ballot. So, once that announcement is made, that timeline starts. What's interesting is that California's governor actually just signed a bill on Friday that adds a way for cities to actually consolidate recalls like this with a regularly scheduled election, like the November 8th election. As long as a regularly scheduled election happens within 180 days of that verification announcement, local recalls will now be able to be consolidated with that regularly scheduled election.
And last but not least, there are 3 recalls happening in Michigan. Who would like to fill us in on the story there?
I can start with one of them, but in general, yes, Michigan has been the leader in recalls this year with 110 officials included in recalls in 2022. That's almost a third of all the recalls we've tracked this year. So in Maple Valley Township, Michigan, there is a recall election for Township Supervisor John Schwant. Resident Robin Polson initiated the recall effort, and the petition included Schwant's vote in favor of a 6-month moratorium on wind energy projects as the reason for the recall effort. That vote happened in a meeting on March 8th, 2021. And Schwant issued a statement saying that the language in the petition was not factual. Michigan recall elections are much like special elections, so Schwant will be facing a candidate, Daniel Bose, on November 8th.
And then there are 2 separate township supervisor and board of trustees recalls in Michigan, one in Douglas Township and the other in Richfield Township. In Douglas Township, the supervisor Terry Anderson, clerk Rhonda Snyder, and trustee Tom Jepson are being recalled for their support of appointing Paul Olson to the Douglas Township Planning Commission. This recall was initiated by a resident, Ben Reynolds. And in Richfield Township, the township supervisor, John Baywall, clerk Greg Watt, and treasurer Terry Heidi are facing a recall for voting in favor of excessive salary increases for township officials in a meeting last March. Resident Lori Dare Pilibosian was among the recall's organizers, and according to the Houghton Lake Resorter, the board approved a 21% increase for the clerk position salary, a 15% or 14% increase for the treasurer position, and a 6% increase for the supervisor position, which recall supporters deemed excessive in their submission of those signatures.
Well, thank you both for coming on today and breaking down all of this recall election coverage that we have. Hopefully we haven't scared you away, Abby, and we can have you on soon. And Doug, you're always welcome. Thank you both for coming on.
Hey listeners, Jeff Halley, Ballotpedia's editor-in-chief. One of the best ways to get ready for the midterms this year is by checking out your ballot before you head to the polls. And our Stamp a Ballot tool makes finding out the candidates and issues on your ballot easier than ever. Just plug in your address and you'll get an interactive look at everything you can expect on your ballot this fall. It's free, easy to use, and we never store your information, so you can safely and securely find out more about the political issues of your district. Check it out at ballotpedia.org or via the link in our show notes.
It's your favorite part of the day. Or at least I like to think so. Just tell me it is, even if it's not true. My ego is very fragile. It's Footnote Facts, everybody. I, Paul Rader, am back to give you more sweet, edifying trivia. We just celebrated 15 years at Ballotpedia. Now it's episode 15. Today is about the timing of elections. And the question of the day is, what is the only state that regularly holds its state judicial elections solely in odd-numbered years? That was sort of a mouthful. I'm particularly excited about today's topic because recently I led a BP book club related to this topic. The book was Timing and Turnout, How Off-Cycle Elections Favor Organized Groups by Sarah Anzia, which is a great read. And I even had the chance to interview her in our second to last week of the book club, which was a fantastic discussion. So we'll be touching on some of the info from the book and from that conversation in this segment. Now, when it comes to election timing, perhaps the biggest thing to know is elections happen practically all the time. Most people know about November general elections in even-numbered years, but we also see some in November of odd-numbered years. Then there are lots of local elections that are held in the spring of even or odd-numbered years, like in May or June. Then throw in primaries, which can be 2, 3, 4, or more months before generals, and the inherently irregularly timed special elections, and the US election calendar gets very scattered. But how did we get to this anything but uniform election schedule? Without giving a bunch of Sarah's book away, the calendar has been like this since at least the mid to late 19th century, probably earlier. A lot of the rules for when elections can be held have changed a lot since then, but generally speaking, local governments have varying amounts of leeway given by their state governments as to when they can hold elections. So, here are some more key things to know about election timing in the US. And note that this is regarding regularly scheduled elections, not specials. So we have 4 states that hold state legislative elections in odd-numbered years. That's Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Virginia. And those 4 states in Kentucky have gubernatorial elections in odd years as well, along with other state executive officials. Then Wisconsin has its superintendent of public instruction election in odd years too. And that general election is in April. Furthermore, on state legislatures, the vast majority of states have elections every 2 years. Many times it's staggered where only half of a state senate is up every 2 years, but sometimes they are all up for election at the same time. And almost every state house has 2-year terms. But in Alabama, Louisiana, Maryland, and Mississippi, state legislative elections only happen every 4 years because both their state houses and senates have 4-year terms, and they are all up for election at the same time. And lastly, for governor's elections, 36 states hold them in midterm years. There are the aforementioned 5 states that hold them in odd years, and then 11 states that hold them in presidential years. You may notice that equals 52, but that's because Vermont and New Hampshire are the only states where governors have 2-year terms, so they are up in midterms and presidential years. Now, to wrap things up, we revisit the trivia question. What is the only state that regularly holds its state judicial elections solely in odd-numbered years? And that would be Pennsylvania. And if that was your answer, with this being the 15th episode and following our 15th anniversary celebration, I award you 1,500 points from my personal vault. No, I'm not going to give you the PIN code, but I am giving the floor back over to Victoria to end the show.
Thanks, Paul. We just passed the first Monday in October, which means that the Supreme Court has returned from its summer recess to begin their October term. Now's the perfect time to subscribe to the Rope and Gavel newsletter to keep up with SCOTUS's rulings and analysis, as well as the latest news regarding our federal courts. Here's a quick look at some of the biggest stories from this week's edition. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson started her first term on the court. She was sworn in on June 30th, becoming the first Black woman to join the U.S. Supreme Court. SCOTUS heard arguments on October 3rd and 4th on 4 cases. The cases related to the EPA's wetland regulatory jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act, redistricting in Alabama and the Voting Rights Act, the doctrine of equitable tolling, and the disposition of abandoned money orders and Traveler's Checks Act. To dive into the happenings of the Supreme Court, go to ballotpedia.org and find the email updates tab, or use the link in our show notes to sign up for the Robe and Gavel newsletter, or to check out our other newsletters. And that's all I have for you on this week's episode of On the Ballot. Thanks again to Doug, Abby, and Paul for coming on the show with me today. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back in your podcast feed next Thursday afternoon with a preview of the ballot measures we're watching this midterm season. Until then, if you have any questions, comments, or love for Ballotpedia, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.